Good afternoon. My name is Carl Peckman. I am the director of the National Regulatory Research Institute. It's with great pleasure that I'm hosting the my first webinar since joining NRRI as director last April. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Granger Morgan and Jeff Daigle as our speakers today, as our panelists. They're going to be presenting information from the National Academy of Sciences study, Enhancing the Resilience of the Nation's Electric System. In essence, they'll give us a high-level view of the study and its results. And as we all know in the electric industry, that resilience has become increasingly important. Notions of what is resilience are important and how we incorporate that into the regulatory environment are all new topics for us, and we very much look forward to the comments of our two panelists. I am just so honored today that we have Professor Morgan and Jeff Daigle here. Professor Morgan is somebody whose career I've followed for many years. He has truly been an intellectual leader in public policy and the evaluation of uncertainty, risk and uncertainty. In addition to his academic pursuits, he has been actively involved in public policy for many years. We thank you for your involvement in public policy, Professor Granger. Jeff Daigle is an engineer at the Pacific Northwest National Lab. And as an economist, which is my background, who's been in the electrical business for many years, I have from time to time run into rare engineers who are both fantastic engineers and have a great sense of public policy. And Jeff fits that boat, and so it's a real pleasure to have him with us today. His specific area of engineering expertise is evaluation of control technologies in the electric system. But I think what's important for us today is that Jeff has been actively involved in a number of the major studies, the post-action studies, for example, with respect to Katrina and the Northeast blackout of 2003. So he brings a lot of hands-on experience and experience as an engineer to us. I'm really looking forward to their comments and looking forward to your questions. And with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Professor Morgan.
Okay, and if we could have the first slide.
Excuse me, Professor Morgan, I've just been reminded that the first slide is actually on asking questions. And
okay. Anyway, the slide that I saw a moment ago is just fine.
Okay, so we'll go back to you. Excuse me for interrupting.
Yeah. So if we could get the front, yes. So Jeff and I are going to tell you about a study that we participated in at the National Academies that wrapped up in 2017, although I think it's still very relevant today. And actually, Jeff and I are currently involved in another study on modernizing the electricity system. If we could have the next slide. So this study was done at the request of the Congress. The Department of Energy then asked the academies to do the study. The committee members were expert volunteers drawn from a whole variety of different areas. The study ran for about 1.5 years. And you can find the whole study and download it for free. And the last slide, again, will reproduce this URL that's shown at the bottom. Next, please. So here's the committee. And as you can see, a lot of names that you're probably familiar with. Several former PUC commissioners like Gene Fox and Sue Tierney. Terry Boston, who ran the PJM. Mark McGranahan, who comes from EPRI and was is the vice president responsible for the high voltage system, and so on. A very broad set of folks. Next. Now, most disruptions, of course, of the power system are fairly brief and pretty local in extent. They come from things like people driving into power poles, squirrels getting into the wrong place and getting themselves electrocuted, lightning strikes, and other things like that. These outages are not the subject of this report. Our concern is with wide area outages of long duration. Next. And large outages turn out to be much more common than one might think. So this is a log plot, and you can see that, if it was a normal or a Weibull distribution, it would follow the dashed line. In fact, it's got a fat tail. Things like Hurricane Sandy and ice storms and other events are more common than one might immediately expect. And it's those events that we're concerned about in this study. Next. So resilience is different from reliability. The Random House Dictionary of the English defines resilient as the power or the ability to return to the original form, position, or so on after being bent, compressed, or stretched. The ability to recover from illness, depression, adversity, or the like, to spring back, to rebound. And while minimizing the likelihood of large area long duration outages is important, a resilient system is one that acknowledges that such outages will occasionally occur, prepares, despite whatever we do to try to avoid them, prepares to deal with them, minimizes their impact when they do occur, and is able to restore service quickly and draws lessons from experience to improve performance in the future. And that last line is also quite important. Next. So this is how we chose to frame our discussion. This picture is actually modified from a paper that a guy named Flynn published in Foreign Affairs. And we've changed it somewhat. But the key points are that one needs to prepare ahead of time to anticipate events, and obviously also to try to fend them off. And then during the event, the ability to manage the disruption as it unfolds. After the event, the ability to put it back together quickly, and then learn and improve as one goes forward. Next. So here's how the report is organized. We have we have an opening chapter that sort of motivates the whole thing. There's a chapter on today's grid and the evolving system. Sue Tierney did most of the work to write that chapter, and if you're ever looking for a compact chapter to hand to somebody who's coming to electric power for the first time, that's a wonderful source, and I can't take much credit for it, nor can Jeff. Sue did all the heavy lifting on that one. But then we organized the balance of the report around the causes of grid failure, strategies to prepare and mitigate large area long duration blackouts, strategies to reduce harmful consequences, and then putting things back together. So I'm going to talk about chapters 2 and 3. Jeff will talk about 4. I'll talk for a few minutes about 5, and then Jeff will talk about restoring grid function, and I'll do some summary wrap up. Next. Okay, so the first chapter is pretty straightforward. It simply points out that today the modern world is really critically dependent on electricity, and if you take it away, things get very complicated and difficult very quickly. It also notes that for at least the next several decades, most customers are going to continue to depend on the functioning of a large-scale, interconnected, tightly organized, and hierarchically structured electric grid. That is, there will be people going off grid, and there'll be a lot of other developments, but for a long time, we expect that most customers will depend on the conventional grid. And while we should do everything we can to minimize the possibility of large outages of long duration, they have occurred and there will continue to occur, though we don't like that fact. Next. So Chapter 2 is organized as shown here. And as I said, if you're ever looking for a really nice compact description of the current and likely future evolution of the system to hand to somebody who's just coming into this field, this is a really good place to start. Next. And this chapter, of course, points out that the electricity system is very organizationally complex. I mean, nobody's in charge, or rather, lots of different people are in charge of different pieces of it. And so we have many different utilities. We got a variety of synchronous regions. We got a whole bunch of different power pools. And this complicates substantially the issue of managing and dealing with, and especially of responding to or doing planning and coherent forward thinking. Next. A word about metrics. I mean, if you're worried about reliability, that's fairly straightforward in terms of metrics, because I can look back at and do statistics on past outages. And so many of you probably know about things like the system average interruption frequency index and the system average interruption duration index and so on. It's nowhere near as easy to come up with metrics for resilience, because by definition, the kinds of events we're talking about are pretty rare. So you can't do statistical analysis. The report suggests that we could do various kinds of simulation studies in order to try to begin to work on metrics. There have been some proposals for metrics, and we also argue that that they ought to be looked at a little more critically than they have been in the past. And we recommend that DOE work on improved studies to assess the value to customers of full and partial service during long outages as a function of key circumstances. And actually, Lawrence Berkeley Labs is actively doing some of that kind of work right now. Next. So we wrap up Chapter 2 with 5 summary observations. First, that the grid is undergoing dramatic change, but a lot of that hardware is going to be there for a long time, so it limits the speed with which change can occur. And as I said before, no single entity is in charge of planning the evolution of the grid, and that makes life more complicated. All players will be concerned about reliability, but only a few are focused on a serious way on identifying growing system-wide vulnerabilities or identifying changes needed to assure resilience. For most people, resilience is not their prime responsibility, and virtually no one has primary mission for building and sustaining increased system-wide resilience. Next. Okay, so I'll say a couple words about what causes or what could cause large, widespread outages. Next. And basically, 2 kinds of things. On the bottom list here, I've got natural hazards, and you can read faster than I can talk, so you can get some sense. The upper branch is, physical or cyber or maybe operational errors. And the next slide, next. Rather than sort of going through all of those, I thought I would just sort of give you a montage here of a few things. These 2 reports on the left, the orange one or red one in the back is an old OTA report that many years ago pointed out that we have high vulnerability for the power system. Then the next one, terrorism and the electric power delivery system, is an Academy report. You can download that one from the web as well. That's a study that I chaired that looked at the problems and the vulnerabilities from terrorist attack. The picture in the lower left is to remind us that earthquakes can be very devastating to power system. The picture right in the middle, of course, is from one of the transmission lines coming down from Hydro-Quebec, from the project in northern Labrador, Le Grand. And this was a collapse caused by an ice storm. The ones on the right, the purple one and the Jason study, are to remind us that solar mass ejection, solar storms, can induce large ground currents and cause big difficulties. And actually, this picture in the lower right, where you see that column of color, that's not a single tornado. That's a whole slew of tornadoes that came through one right after the other and happened to wipe out quite a lot of existing physical infrastructure in the power system. Next. And the last thing on this topic is that the amount of warning time you get and how long it takes to put things back together both vary. Notice, for example, that earthquakes, it says 0 to minutes. Well, that's because if I have instrumentation in place, I can sense the earthquake out at the site where the fault occurs and then get upwards to maybe seconds to minutes of advance warning that earthquake waves are coming, because the speed of light's a good deal faster than the speed of earthquake waves. And one of the things we talk about in the report is something that hasn't been put in place to the best that I am aware, and that is the notion of preemptive shutting down. I mean, if you're going to have a substation hit by an earthquake, you may be much better off to de-energize it than to just keep it powered and let things arc out as stuff rattles around. Next. Okay, so I'm going to hand things off to Jeff now. Next.
Thank you, Granger. So next slide, slide 19, please. So chapter 4, we were looking at strategies to mitigate these large area, long duration blackouts should they occur. As Granger previously mentioned, the goal is to minimize these, but and different technologies or techniques can be used to do that. One of the things that people often look at is component hardening, physical security, things like that, particularly on the distribution side. There's things that can be done to enhance the resilience to wind, and maybe locating substations to eliminate the flooding risk, that sort of thing. A lot's been done over many years in the area of distribution automation. In the report, we have a great case study of the Electric Power Board of Chattanooga that spent some significant resources, and part of it was a DOE Smart Grid Investment Grant from a few years ago, to automate their distribution system. And they had some great statistics of showing storm restoration before they made those investments and after they made those investments, and significant enhancement in the speed of recovery of their service by being able to switch around faulted feeders and things like that. So there's quite a bit more that we believe that could be done in the area of distribution automation, and maybe some of the other utilities could learn from the practices that others have adopted, and maybe share some of those best practices. We give some examples of that in the report. The next point is on distributed energy resources. This is a very interesting topic, because when DER, things like rooftop solar and other small scale generation that's connected into the distribution system, when that was first started to show up in significant numbers, the first concern by the system operators were safety considerations. And so the goal was to make absolutely sure that those generation sources came offline if there was an outage, so that there didn't backfeed into the feeders and cause an electrocution hazard to the responders or others. And so the original focus of the IEEE 1547 DER interconnection standards were focused in that area. But then as more and more DER comes on the system, it's a broader recognition that perhaps they need to be better at riding through disturbances. They don't immediately get off the system, but also, can stay on and hang on through that. So we recognize those trends. But we also, in the report, we're looking at things that DER can do going forward in the future to make the system even more resilient. So, for example, could you use DER as a foundational building block for bringing the system back and restoring power, and maybe, instead of waiting for the transmission system to be energized, maybe you can energize a neighborhood with DER and then connect to the transmission system when the substation was ready, and that sort of thing. So we see opportunities in the future to make greater use of DER, particularly in the restoration phase of things. Modeling and simulation is always important, and there is a new effort at the Department of Energy associated with resilience modeling for the North American system. And so efforts like that go a long ways towards better understanding the situation and what we can do about it. In addition to that, the wide area monitoring and control. I'm personally involved in something called the North American Synchrophaser Initiative, but efforts like that and other things to improve situational awareness during an emergency or off-normal event is always helpful. Quite a bit was written in the report on intelligent load shedding, including demand response and those technologies, but more importantly, how they could be organized into something that we call adaptive islanding. And so the way that the system is operated today is the goal is to maintain the integrity of the interconnection and do things to preserve the system as a whole by either under-frequency load shedding or things like that. But the goal in the future, I believe, could be to selectively break the system into smaller islands during an emergency, and then allow the recovery to take place, and that would limit the amount of customers that are lost during the initial event. And a lot of research papers have been written on that. I think the next step on that is more large-scale demonstrations to ensure that the cure isn't worse than the problem we're trying to solve through other considerations. The next point is on architectural considerations to reduce criticality of individual components. This is something that the electricity industry has been doing, since its inception. But more thought can be given to, making sure that, instead of one large substation, maybe two smaller substations or things like that, segmenting and other types of design trade-offs that can be made to improve resilience. Reducing the dependency on supporting infrastructures is something that we also have a great deal of concern about. The biggest trend in this category is the increased dependency on natural gas for electric power generation that we haven't seen in the past, but we're also concerned about dependency on communications, transportation networks, etc. And if we go to the next slide, slide 20, we spent quite a bit of effort on cyber resilience. Cybersecurity has been with us for a number of years. There's industry standards, including the NRRI critical infrastructure protection requirements that are in place for the bulk electricity system. Many jurisdictions on distribution have cybersecurity requirements that either follow the NRRI CIP standards or look at other frameworks for improving security. But one of the things that we talked about in the report is that security is necessary, but maybe not sufficient. And part of the challenge can be if a system is compromised in a very major way, potentially by a sophisticated adversary, bringing back these cyber systems could be incredibly difficult, particularly if that hasn't been really worked out in advance and practiced and drilled and trained and have the mechanisms in place to help with that recovery. So we believe that looking at the cybersecurity more from a resilience standpoint is something that the nation hasn't done as much of, and there's some opportunities to look at that in a little more sophisticated and expansive way. So if we can go to the next slide, these 10 recommendations are the kind of wrapping up chapter 4. The first point on grant programs, some of the things that we've talked about in the report is a lot of reliability investment today that's done by industry is fundamentally ratepayer financed. And the rates that customers pay for the electricity, part of that includes the investments necessary to enhance or sustain reliability metrics. Oftentimes, jurisdictions might get grants from other sources of funding, so maybe more of a blend of taxpayer-funded investment with the ratepayer-funded investment for things that have broader societal goals. And so that opportunity to make investments in resilience might come from some non-traditional sources. We saw some evidence or examples of this. For example, following Superstorm Sandy, there were some states that put in some programs to reimburse utilities for making some resilience enhancements. And so more of that we think is a good idea. Research, development, demonstration is always good, particularly on these distributed energy resources. Modeling to mitigate severe events. The synthetic data models at realistic scale. This is one that was recognized by the research community, particularly at universities. It can sometimes be difficult to get access to this type of data for really understanding what the possibilities are to improve the system, improve the resilience of the system. And so if we had synthetic data that was realistic and can be used to provide that framework for that type of research and analysis, there would be some benefit there, broader societal benefit. The use cases for load shedding and using AMI and others, that could lead to demonstration projects. The technologies for sustaining critical functionality gets into fail-safe modes of operation. I also talked about the information sharing between the infrastructures. That's sometimes a real challenge. You would think that electric utility operators should be able to get timely and complete information about the natural gas infrastructure that they depend on, but that's not always the case. And wide area situational awareness is good, standardized methods of sharing system status, and then architectural designs to support resilience are other recommendations that we had out of this chapter. So next slide is chapter 5, and I'm going to turn the floor back to Granger.
Thank you, Jeff. If we could have the next slide. Next, please. Yeah. So experience suggests that a lot of the equipment designed to restore power service doesn't actually always work when it's needed. I mean, during some of the recent large outages, we've had hospitals and other places that found that their generators wouldn't start. And so obviously, one of the first things one needs to do is to make sure that these capabilities are routinely tested, and furthermore, that there are in place systems to assure continued fuel supply. And that gets complicated, of course, because sometimes governors or others will intervene and say, well, yeah, I know that tanker truck is supposed to go to such and such, but I need it over here. So worrying that the existing stuff will work is an important first step. And then we need work on more advanced preparations for use of non-traditional sources. For example, during the one of the Canadian ice storms, a number of locomotives got used, but you can't use a diesel locomotive unless you got the box that's needed to convert the power from that to 60 hertz AC, and you got to have that box ahead of time. And so doing some things like that. Ships are another example. I mean, a cruise ship is basically an enormous floating generator, and for many of the population, they're in coastal cities, and so though the Navy doesn't like to talk about it, the Navy has provided power on occasion, and so more preparation for those sorts of things. And then steps should also be taken to make it possible for people with rooftop PV to obtain power during outages. Many of you probably know that current inverters are designed, as Jeff implied, that whenever the grid goes down, they disconnect. And so I've got a PV system on my roof. I may even have batteries, but in most cases, I can't get any electricity out of it, given the way the system has been designed. And so there's no particular reason, with appropriate design and care for safety, that homes with PV or other facilities with PV on the roof and battery storage could disconnect. And the other thing that's increasingly happening is we're getting hybrid and fuel cell vehicles. And so if you stop to think about it, a hybrid vehicle sitting in my driveway is a little mobile generator. And though at the moment it would violate warranties if I ran the car not in the garage, obviously, out on the drive where it wouldn't cause carbon monoxide, to provide a little power for a house or some building, it could also be a valuable development. At the moment, the only example of that I'm aware of is the fuel cell vehicle that Toyota is developing, but there, in principle, could be quite a lot of possibilities in that space. Next slide, please. And so there's been studies of the value of electric power in the context of short outages. I mean, as I mentioned before, Lawrence Berkeley Labs has, well, a lot of utilities have done private studies, and then there are contractors who worked with LB&L who have gotten proprietary access to those data and have available and done regression analysis, so you can estimate as a function of duration costs, but they're all pretty much less than a day. And so there's a real need for studies that look at much longer duration studies. As a matter of fact, I've had a doctoral student here at Carnegie Mellon who has done quite a bit of that sort of work, and LB&L ran a workshop in the last year on beginning to think towards longer term outages. You're not going to make a decision just on the basis of those numbers, but it would be awfully good to know the kinds of numbers that are involved as one input to decision making. We've all seen diagrams like this picture at the lower right, and we also all know that they are more in the form largely of view graphs than reality. And so there is work needed to develop the ability to expand the capabilities that smart grid could provide. And I've got one example here in the lower right of the sort of legal changes that could happen to make things like islanding and public and private microgrids feasible. The upper picture shows a 5-story building, and under federal law, if I've got a small DG system in that building, the power company must connect, and I can, of course, if the power goes out, I could continue to run features or structures or systems in the building with my CHP or other DG system. On the other hand, if I take those 5 stories and I plop them down across the countryside, as I've shown, and I cross public rights of way, that's not legal in most US states, because most states have exclusive service territory rules that grant the right to serve others or to cross public rights of way only to licensed utilities. And so one of the things we talk about is the possibility that at modest scale, I mean, we don't want these things to get big, but at modest scale, finding ways to allow some privately owned and operated microgrids down under the distribution system could add significantly to resilience. Of course, there are, as long as you're a single customer like a university campus, you can do this, but if it's an industrial park or something, it's not legal in most states. Next slide. Okay, and so now we're going to hand it back to Jeff to talk a little bit about putting things back together, and then I will wrap up with some overview conclusions. Next slide.
Thank you, Granger. Next slide, please. So restoring the grid after major disruption is the focus of this chapter. And the point of this slide is that it's a scaled response. There's things that happen at the site, the system, and the region. And it includes the steps in restoration, including assessment, provision of the supplies and resources necessary, prioritizing that response, and then executing the repair and managing that. And this is something that the utility industry in general has extremely good experience with and extremely good track record. You know, programs like mutual aid and things like that, where utilities will send line crews to help out neighboring utilities is something that the utility industry is extraordinarily good at. And if you go to the next slide, you know, we recommend that we continue to embrace that. but recognize that in some of these types of events that we've talked about here over the, during this webinar that we talked about in the report, there can be some different challenges in that in those various steps, and depending on the nature of the hazard in the event, there can be some interesting things that occur. So most of what the utility industry is extraordinarily good at is responding to storm damage, whether it's tornadoes, hurricanes, things like that. And particularly in the case of hurricanes, when you have advanced forecasting and projection of the potential damage, staging those resources and assets is something that's kind of become somewhat of a fine science in terms of being able to do that well. And lots of great examples of utilities in places like Florida that have gotten very, very good at that kind of response. But other types of events, like cyber and these other types of things, the response is really completely different. And so we're recommending that there's more that can be done to really look at across these all hazards and the different types of threats that could occur to really look at this in a more holistic way. So next slide. What I'll do is just tick through the recommendations that came out of Chapter 6 and some things that we can do to enhance and improve upon what the utility industry is already doing in this area. The first one is universal credentialing. This is still an issue when crews show up from other jurisdictions and getting access to things that might be cordoned off from a first response standpoint and that sort of thing. And also think about it in terms of expertise that might be on the cyber side as well. It's just a different type of mindset that we need. For sure, collecting and share lessons learned from prior events. This is the feedback loop in the basic steps of resilience that Granger introduced several slides ago. It's always important to improve the next time if we can learn from the last time. Contractual requirements for using DER to enhance restoration. I kind of alluded to that earlier. If we're really using DER for black start, for example, how do we organize that and pay for it and provision that? Preemptive de-energizing is something we talked about a little bit. The Granger mentioned the earthquake and having earthquake detection. If you know a few seconds before an earthquake hits, if you could shut down the system before the earthquake strikes, and that could save some of the damage from the equipment shorting out and save at least the electrical short circuits that would occur during the earthquake, and that would help improve the restoration. Utilization of UAVs or unmanned aerial vehicles is something that I know the utility industry is doing quite a bit more, and that's a dramatically expanding field. Even since this report was written a couple of years ago, there's many more things that utilities are doing with drones and whatnot. But there are still issues in terms of licensing. Currently the rules are that the drone operators need to be line of sight, and that could thwart some of the restoration efforts if you're trying to run drones out over a broader area. I think there are some exceptions now to that rule, but that's still an area that we can still look at. The next two talk about transformers. In the event of a major disruption, particularly if it's maybe a physical attack, some of the transformer recovery times can be quite extensive, and so having replacement transformers that can be brought in to recover would be something that's been a recurring theme in any report talking about grid vulnerabilities and grid security and grid resilience. Transformers is one of those topics that just never goes away because we're still looking for a good solution there to bring in large, long lead time item devices that would be needed. Anomaly detection, particularly in the cyber area, is something that could receive additional attention. This interagency coordination is something particularly for things that involve multiple agencies and it might cut across multiple sectors. If in a major cyber attack, it's likely that the cyber attack would be broader than the electricity industry. So how do we coordinate that with with other elements of the federal government that might be in response to that, if it's particularly if it's a nation-state adversary. We haven't worked out all those details, even though there's things that include tabletop drills and things. Really working that out is still work to be done. Testing and recovery exercises and are things that also we touch on. And then finally on the investigation process, you know, NERC has come a long way in terms of managing blackouts or reliability incidents that occur to the bulk electricity system. But we think that there's room for a better formalized process to gather and analyze information that might come from these significant events. So this summarizes the recommendations from Chapter 6. And so if we go to the next slide and return the presentation back to Granger.
So as you've seen, Jeff has ticked off a whole bunch of recommendations, and when this report went into review at the National Academies, the reviewers or the folks in charge said, we only want a handful of recommendations. You got way too many. So we ended up lumping them together and directing them at different parties. And if you download a copy of the report, you can find that. But what I'm going to do now is just walk you through a set of overarching recommendations. The first of which is that we really need to be doing more regional preparedness exercises. We do these regularly, but we need to do them for more extreme events and you know, these sort of impairments that can result in very large scale loss of power and critical infrastructure sectors over extended periods. Next. The second recommendation is that we got a bunch of technology that could help increase resilience today. We need to get more of it out in place. And of course, part of the problem is how do you pay for it? And we do talk a bit about it. And Jeff made some reference to the fact that maybe you don't pay for it all through classic rate-based ratepayer design, because these are sorts of things that are important for society as a whole. Next. Then we think it's really important to continue the kind of research that the DOE's Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability and the Office of Energy Efficiency have done with respect to grid modernization. And the next slide makes the same comment with respect to cyber. Next, yeah. And we should substantially increase the resources committed to the physical components to ensure that critical electric infrastructure is robust. Next. And this is the one, I guess, that makes the same case for cyber. And then finally, next, we recommend that we need to spend more time thinking about what could happen. And we call that visioning. And we argued that the Department of Energy and the Department of Homeland Security should jointly establish some activities to envision the sort of things that could go wrong for large area, long duration grid disruptions and all the consequences that could derive from that. Next. And then using those views of what could happen, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the North American Electric Reliability Corporation ought to establish some small working groups that are informed by those visions to assess and, as needed, mandate strategies designed to increase the resilience of the bulk power system. Next. And then the same sort of thing should happen at the regional and state and utility level. NRECA should work with the National Association of State Energy Officials to provide guidance to state regulators on how best to respond to and deal with some of these issues, and each state public utility commission and state energy office ought to establish some standing capability to identify vulnerabilities, identify strategies to reduce local vulnerabilities, develop strategies to cover costs. And that's a key point, of course, because you probably can't justify paying for a lot of this other things that are needed with conventional rate-based schemes. And the bottom line is that all of this is difficult because, as we say in the report, there's no single party that's responsible for resilience of the system. Next. And so with that, we're going to wrap up. This is the URL that'll get you to the report, and it's free. You can download it. I guess we stand ready to answer questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That was terrific. I did want to return to one of the points you made towards the end of your presentation. As regulators, one of our primary functions is to create mechanisms for cost recovery, and the way that we do that, at least in part, is by evaluating what are prudent decisions on the part of the utility. Given the information that's known and knowable, was it a reasonable decision at the time? Do you have any perspectives in terms of how regulators might look at what would be how to think about prudence with respect to maintaining resilience that may be different than, for example, replacing a generator where the costs are somewhat more known and the needs are more well defined?
Well, Jeff may want to elaborate, but we talk a little bit about this. We did not. I mean, this is a really tough problem. It's a problem that it's partly a problem because, as I said several times, nobody is responsible for resilience across the whole system. We've got a system in place that's become even more focused on sort of short-term profit maximizing kinds of arrangements, which aren't very well suited to deal with very low probability, high consequence events. What part of the answer, of course, is it depends critically on where you're talking about. I mean, the vulnerability of different parts of different physical regions is quite different. I mean, we don't get hurricanes in, upstate Minnesota. We do get ice storms, and so the kinds of events that can happen can be quite different. And for many cases, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to make investments because the probability of a major event is so low. But there are places where the probabilities begin to get higher, and so it would make sense for PUCs, as we suggested in the final couple of slides, to begin to think about sort of what are the vulnerabilities in their region, and then to talk with state legislators and others, because in some cases it won't make sense to try to do all of this through conventional rate-based mechanisms. It's going to take, state or in some cases even federal legislation and funds to make some of the things happen.
So I'll just add on a few points. I agree with everything Granger said, but this really gets into the challenge of these high impact, low frequency events. And NRRI and others have put out some reports on that topic, and that touches on the challenge of managing risk for these things that are very rare and infrequent. But part of that rolls into the metrics discussion that we include in our report, and under the heading of you can't manage it if you can't measure it. And so I believe that there is some room for, I don't think we're ready today to say, oh, measure to this metric, and then if it's a prudent investment to improve resilience, because you can watch the resilience metric change as a result of that project. But I think that's the goal of where we want to get to, so we can actually measure resilience. Then you could do a better job of looking at these engineering trade-offs, the different options, the different things that we can do to improve the resilience of the system.
And to do that, you need simulation studies, because you're not, unlike the reliability metrics, you're not going to do that with just on a statistical basis. And so you got to be able to simulate systems using, for example, some of the kinds of network models that some of Jeff's colleagues did PNNL build. And then you need to start stressing them and asking, under these scenarios, how resilient am I, and so on.
Yeah, for sure. Preparedness, measuring preparedness is a leading indicator. Measuring things that have happened is a lagging indicator. And so your reliability statistics, eventually, these rare events might occur and they'll show up in your reliability statistics, but that's not a measure of how prepared you are for next time.
So just as an aside, one of the studies that we at the National Regulatory Research Institute are just initiating, we're calling it rate making for catastrophic cyber obsolescence. In other words, as we look at different assets on the grid, to the extent that some of these may be obsolete because of the cyber risk, how do we treat them for rate-making purposes? And our sense is that it's not only new investments, but existing investments that are important for resilience, and that how we treat those in rates will really affect the behavior and incentives that utilities have.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And in the modernization study that I mentioned, we have a number of folks who are just now beginning to think about those issues, which are really messy. Particularly that we've got a lot of legacy stuff out there on the grid that, much of which got put in place before people were quite as concerned or aware of the cyber dimensions of issues as they now are.
Right, and much of that is still has remaining life from a bookkeeping or regulatory standpoint. Let me turn to remind the folks on the phone that you can send us questions, and I'm going to turn to one of the questions that we've received. On page 6, the report, it states, a resilient system draws lessons from the experience to improve performance. Are failure data being collected to support modeling that optimizes regional system scale against target failure types? What is the best physical system spatial scale for interconnected components of large regional, sub-regional, district, local, etc., to maximize failure?
Okay, well,
let me know if you want me to repeat that.
Sure. No, I think I got it. I'll make a stab at it, and then we can see if that fits the question. So a very good question. I think that the challenge is that some of this data is collected, but it's not necessarily available broadly, and so that's one of the challenges. The other challenge, I think, is that the scale of really looking at things is, in my opinion, I think really, if you're looking at the transmission infrastructure, it does require looking at it at an interconnection scale, just because of the interconnectedness and the fact that something in one region can affect something somewhere else in that region. So obviously those interconnection scales vary a lot. Texas is different than Eastern Interconnection. To date, the influence across those interconnections is negligible. So I'm okay limiting it to an interconnection, but that's not much of a limit if you're in the Eastern Interconnection. It's a very, very large system, a lot of entities, and so the challenge of gathering up all of the data that you need in terms of planning models, statistics in terms of what has happened, and those types of things, that does not exist in sort of one location. And so the Department of Energy is looking to make a contribution in this space with our new Assistant Secretary of Energy, Bruce Walker. His top priority is a North American energy system resilience model that can look at the bulk electricity system and the interdependencies with things like other energy infrastructures like natural gas, and really look at that from a multi-sector modeling perspective, where we can bring that information in both at the planning side as well as with operational type information. This is a multi-year effort that's going to be a very substantive level of effort, and so it'll be a while before we can make significant progress on that. But I think that's the challenge. In my mind, the challenge is really the data aggregation piece.
So Jeff, you've done a bunch of event reconstruction. You might just talk a little bit about the sorts of issues that arise in terms of trying to put together all the information one needs to figure out after the fact what happened and how to draw lessons from it.
Right. Yeah. One of the things I had the opportunity to get involved in was the investigation of the August 14, 2003 blackout. And I was loaned by DOE to help NERC on that blackout investigation team. And they put me in charge of the data requests and management piece. And so that was gathering the data from the utilities, the affected utilities, and putting that information together to support the other aspects of the investigation team, the root cause team, the transmission team, generation team, sequence of events team, that sort of thing. And just the sheer volume, but also the disparate nature of the different types of data. You know, one utility would sort of report it one way, and another utility would report it another way. There were, back in 2003, there was a lot of problems with the timing of the information. With some you know, the information, the event would occur in the field, and it might not get time stamped until it showed up in a computer log several seconds later, and so things were off by seconds. Even a couple data sets were off by minutes, which is hard to believe, but it was. And so trying to piece together an accurate picture of what happened, particularly during the fast sequence of events that started up at about 4:10 in the afternoon that day. You know, the stuff that was occurring over the hour leading up to it was a lot easier. You know, this line tripped, and then 15 minutes later that line tripped. But when you get to, you know, when things were happening within a few seconds or milliseconds of each other, piecing that together literally took months of effort to bring all that information together.
What's your sense of how much progress we've made in so that it won't be quite so hard the next time around? Because I think that goes to the question we just got.
Yeah. So there is some advancements. You know, a lot more of the data is time synchronized using things like GPS clocks and whatnot. So we have microsecond accuracy now of a lot of our sequence of events records and things like that. That helps a lot. But it's still getting the information gathered together to do that kind of analysis. Still requires you know, person-to-person type of interaction between different organizations to request the information. And then if the lawyers get involved, it slows it down significantly if there's disclosure agreements that need to be signed and that sort of thing. So in my mind, I think one of the things that could really aid this a lot is working through a process where an entity that has, you know, the right sort of jurisdiction and justification for putting this information together, you know, maybe it's a reliability coordinator, or maybe it's a NERC or something like that, where they can automate this process to you know, as things happen on the grid, these statistics roll up and are added to a, you know, sort of a national or at least interconnection scale model, so that can inform the model and bring that together in a way that takes less engineering time. I think that would be a significant enhancement.
So just following up on that, it seems to me that syncophasers really help in terms of the analysis of events, and it might be helpful for you to explain just exactly what syncophasers are for folks, and sort of the magic of syncophasers in terms of coordinating the data across the grid, and how things have changed that way.
Okay, certainly. Yeah, one of the enabling technologies of synchrophasers is ubiquitous access to a highly precise time. And
so actually, back up, Jeff, and explain what these things measure. You know, the phase angle between the voltage, right, and the current wave. Yeah.
Right. So in North America, we run a 60 hertz grid. That just means it's close to 60 hertz. It's never exactly 60 hertz. The frequency meanders based on what's actually happening on the system with the balance of load and generation, and so it's always moving around, but it's close to 60 hertz. And by having access to precise time, then you can measure that 60 hertz waveform, 60 cycles per second, and you can look at the relative phasing of that waveform at one location compared to the 60 hertz waveform at another location. And so precisely when those, the voltage or the current or whatever you're measuring, you know, when it crests at the top and goes by zero and dips down through the bottom, each you know, of those 60 times per second, if you can have microsecond class accuracy, right? 1 60 hertz cycle is 16.67 milliseconds, and so to get 1 degree of precision, you're going to need about 15 microseconds or so of resolution. The good news is that GPS clocks and that class of technology can give you microsecond accuracy, and so you can measure greater than 1 degree.
Pause right there. Pause right there, because you went by pretty fast. Explain that GPS satellites then have, very high resolution time, and so that's how I know across the system what time these various events are.
Right. Exactly. So if I know at this exact time that the phase angle is doing this at this location, and at that exact same time it's doing something else in another location, we're at a different spot on that 60 hertz waveform, then I know the relative phase angle between that voltage between point A and point B. And so that's why they call it a phasor measurement unit. We're measuring the phase angle between different parts of the grid. And that's enabled by the fact that we have accurate clocks at both locations, so that we can, when we report that data to a central location and it's gathering that together, the timestamps of what's actually happening correspond to the same time, right? And so you can line those things up. Before we had access to microsecond precision, I could measure the voltage, at one location. I could measure the voltage at another location, but the time wouldn't be accurate enough for me to say, okay, the relative phase angle is, 10 degrees between this place and that place. You wouldn't be able to make that determination without the same time at both places.
So, Carl, the other issue that is important, of course, is we put a whole lot of these things in place fairly quickly. We're still catching up on making full use of this capability. There are systems, of course, that are now making very substantial use, but there's still quite a ways to go.
And just to put that in perspective, we're talking about big data with respect to the information that you get out of a synchrophaser.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of times people are interested. If you go to the time and effort to install something with this precise clock, you have something that can stream data at multiple measurements per second. A typical phasor measurement unit would be about 30 samples per second, or 30 measurements per second. Some of them are faster than that. And contrasted to your traditional supervisor control and data acquisition or SCADA telemetry, which might be one measurement every 1 or 2 seconds, it's a significant increase in the amount of data volume that you get from your measurement infrastructure. And so the good news on that is bandwidth is cheap in terms of communication networks. Storage is cheap in terms of disk storage. So if we were trying to do this back in the 80s when bandwidth was fairly expensive and disk drives were fairly expensive, this technology just would still be, wouldn't be implemented because it would just be too expensive to try. But now with those things that are very inexpensive in terms of communications and storage, utilities are seeing some value in this. To Granger's point, we're still working through all the use cases and business justifications of what you do with it. Some utilities are much further ahead than others in terms of adopting this technology and doing useful things with it. And one of the things that the Department of Energy's North American Synchrophaser Initiative is all about is providing a forum for utilities to share practices and information about what they're doing with it so the others can learn from it. And so if you're interested in more about synchrophasers, our website is naspi.org, and so that stands for North American Synchrophaser Initiative.
Okay, so we have another question from our participants, which is if you could provide more information on efforts to quantitatively define resilience metrics. Where are we in that process? What do you see coming out of that process? Do you have any favored candidates? And is it going to be necessary to have multiple metrics?
Why don't I take this one? And the answer is we're still at a pretty primitive stage. I mean, as I said before, unlike reliability metrics where I can look back at, dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of past events and do statistics. Fortunately, I can't do statistics on these very large outages of long duration. We don't get them very often and hopefully we'll get them less often. But so that's why I suggested that really what needs to happen is one needs to start doing simulation studies with realistic models of the grid. And there are people beginning to do these sorts of things, but it's still in much too early a stage. And actually, some of the folks in Jeff's shop at PNNL are certainly among those in the best position to do these kinds of studies, but we just need to do many more. And the reason we proposed this visioning stuff at the end of the report is that first you got to sort of think about what are the kinds of events that you got to worry about. Then you got to say, all right, if the event unfolds this way, what are the implications if it unfolds that way? And so it's essentially a matter of trying to build the kinds of models that can prospectively anticipate what's going to happen, and then ask, so what kinds are there things that I could do today that would make me less vulnerable? On the issue of will there likely be multiple approach, or is there a need for multiple approaches? Yes, absolutely. Jeff, you want to add?
Yeah, and I think you summed it up very well. I guess the only other shout out I'll give is to the Department of Energy's Grid Modernization Laboratory Consortium has a project on metrics. It includes, but not limited to, resilience metrics. And so they're looking at, there's some other challenging metrics out there as well, trying to define. Almost as challenging as resilience metrics are flexibility metrics. How can you gauge the flexibility of the power system to accommodate some of these non-dispatchable sources of generation that we're increasingly seeing on the system? So there's some research effort underway to try to get our arms around some of these metrics. If you want all 6 of them, they're reliability, which we all know we've talked about. There's resilience. There's flexibility. Affordability is an important metric. We're looking at some things that we can do to measure that. Security is another one of these challenging metrics. How do you know when you've made the right kind of security investments? Depending on the wide range of threats that you might have, and then sustainability. Those are the 6 different metric categories that we're working on. But to Granger's point, these are very rudimentary at this point. There's sort of a broad recognition that we need to have better metrics, but we don't really have anything ready to roll out saying, here, use this one.
So we had an economist on our panel who insisted that we had to get metrics first before we could do much of anything. We kept pushing on our dear friend about what did he think those metrics should look like. And we didn't get too far on that front. It's a tough problem.
And that goes directly back to the difficulty of handling prospective projects from a rate-making standpoint. It's less concrete for regulators to think about these issues in terms of whether or not it's a prudent decision or a prudent investment or not.
Yeah, well, and also regulators have to work within the legal framework that they're handed. And so let me just use the one example that I talked about of small private microgrids down underneath the distribution system. You can perhaps on an experimental basis approve a few of these things, but in most cases the utility has to agree. That's not the sort of thing that a regulator can address fundamentally. I mean, that is something that the state legislators, the energy committees of the legislature need to think about if they want, for example, to promote the notion that we should have the ability to do more islanding of privately owned systems, or maybe combinations of privately owned systems with utility-owned distribution systems. I mean, some of these things don't fall in the purview of conventional regulatory rate making and the legal environment that regulators operate in. And as I said more times than you probably wanted to hear, nobody's in charge. I mean, at the moment, given, for example, that everything that the electricity part of a PUC has to worrying about some of these broader big picture stuff that we talk about in this report, you just don't have the luxury of spending time on that because you got all these day-to-day things you got to deal with, and that's part of the challenge in this space.
I want to read you a comment that I've received, and then I want to go back to the no one's in charge point that you're making. The comment is that reliability, resilience, and vulnerability are the most commonly used performance criteria for water supply planning and management. A lot of research literature readily exists on this topic. So if you folks afterwards are interested, I'll hook you up with the person who's made that comment, and you can pursue and find out what the water literature actually has looked at with respect to reliability, resilience, and vulnerability. In terms of the point that no one's in charge.
Well, let me elaborate that. A lot of different people are in charge, and very few people have resilience as their prime responsibility.
Right. Yeah, no, I understood that, and forgive me if I mischaracterized it, but I wanted to go back to one of the findings of the Quadrennial Energy Review 1.2, which was talking about the need for a cyber security study planning method that went from the customer's premises through the bulk power system. And I think that recognized, it was predicated upon the fact that there was diffuse oversight over each of the components, and that each of the components needed to become better coordinated to reduce the points of vulnerability. What's your sense in terms of how do we think more closely about integrating the resilience planning between the distribution system and the bulk power system? Do you think, as you know, that the NRRI only has responsibility, it's a big only, for the bulk power system, and doesn't have standards for the distribution systems? So what's your sense of how to organize or better organize thinking about resilience across jurisdictions?
I can talk a little bit. Jeff, you want to go first, though?
Sure, I'll go first. I think this is a great question, a great point, in terms of the separation between transmission and distribution. And historically, that separation might have been fine because the boundary conditions between transmission and distribution were pretty stable. The ability of a distribution system to impact the operation of the transmission system, until recently has been negligible. And so now that boundary condition between the two is much more dynamic, much more vibrant in terms of things going back and forth. Particularly, Carl, you brought up the QER and the cyber side. Particularly the cyber layer, right? Those packets of information and some related to control pass freely between T and D, and yet the regulatory regime is sort of constrained to one side looks at T and the other side looks at D. So I do think that we need to look more carefully at that. And I do realize it gets into deeper issues in terms of the federal government's role versus the states and that sort of thing. But looking at this as a holistic system, recognizing that boundary between transmission and distribution is not only blurring but becoming really non-existent as it relates to not having the ability to influence the other side.
So you started your question by on the customer side of the meter, and of course another development that is potentially quite problematic is the proliferation of Internet of Things, many of which are connected to the grid. And the problem, of course, there is that, well, as in so many other areas, the pressure to get market access means that that security considerations often take the back seat to getting stuff out and quickly into place. And so just as we've got still, stuff out in substations today that probably shouldn't be there because they were rushed out with, I don't know, Windows operating systems and things like that that have lots of known vulnerabilities. We're increasingly doing the same sort of thing in the context of Internet of Things. Now, there's probably been too much loose talk about how those technologies could actually influence or have effects up the line on the power system, but there are at least some cases where the answer is they probably can have effects, and we're not paying enough attention to that either. And again, you see, regulators, neither state nor federal regulators at the moment have a lot of responsibility in those spaces.
Well, does the Department of Homeland Security sort of provide an umbrella over the state and federal jurisdictions?
Well, the DOE is responsible actually for the power part of things, and actually the DOE recently brought up a new office that grew out of the Office of Electricity to worry about some of these sorts of issues. Jeff may be closer to knowing exactly the jurisdictional relationships, but part of the difficulty, of course, is having enough. The expertise in government on the power system is in the national labs. My apologies to the folks from DHS who may be listening, but that's not the locus of the greatest depth of technical expertise with respect to the power system. So there are jurisdictional complications at that level as well.
Yeah, I think at the highest level, DHS has some overarching responsibility, particularly when you look at cybersecurity and things like that. There's interactions between DHS and DoD and the intelligence community, really understanding the foreign threat and what we can do about it, that sort of thing. As it relates to then infrastructure protection, there's a concept called sector-specific agencies, and the Department of Energy is the sector-specific agency that includes the electric power grid, but also other energy infrastructure. And so in the electric power area, there's the Office of Electricity, there's the Office of Energy Efficient Renewable Energy, and then this new office that Granger alluded to is called CSER, and that's a Cyber Security and Emergency Response. And so it's what used to be formerly OE30 in the OE Office of Electricity side. And part of the rationale for pulling out that and creating a new office with Assistant Secretary leadership is to have greater focus on these cybersecurity issues as it related to our energy infrastructure. Now where our conversation was before we started getting into this was about what the regulators can do and that sort of thing. And so DOE does not have regulatory authority to, on the same as like FERC and NERC and the states in terms of telling the utilities what to do. The Federal Power Act, gives DOE some specific authorizations of things in an emergency for things related to national security of emergencies and that sort of thing. But really kind of in this planning mode of trying to come up with things, for example, the recommendations in this study, it's really DOE providing thought leadership that then can be accommodated by the other stakeholders that are involved, including, federal and state regulators.
Well, I think you jumped ahead of my last question, which I'll ask anyway, which is if you have any insights or recommendations we're primarily state regulators as we face these issues with respect to resilience, what would you suggest that we spend our time thinking more about, learning more about, or doing more of?
Well, since the sort of visioning exercise at the national level that we recommended has not, to my knowledge, proceeded, one thing a state regulatory organization might do is, do a little, I mean, you do participate in regular tabletop events, but you might find some way to spend a little bit of time imagining some of the more serious low probability events that could occur in your region, and thinking about, how well organized is the state or the region to deal with it. And this is presumably not something that most BUCs can devote a lot of time to, but it would certainly, even a little bit of time spent sort of off thinking outside the box and trying to engage in a retreat or something to ask, are there a handful of things we could do to be in better shape if the kinds of events that might happen in our region that could have really widespread long duration consequences were to in fact occur. The other thing is, it's awkward, of course, for regulators to talk with staffs and legislatures, but some interactions of those sorts on things like the microgrid example that I mentioned might also make some sense.
And Carl, my answer is going to be a lot shorter. Read the report. I think Granger did a great job as our chair on this study committee, and I'm pretty proud of this report that came out. Obviously, I can't take a lot of credit. I only wrote some small pieces of it, but it came together as a pretty good report.
You can actually take quite a lot of credit.
But if there's anybody within sound of my voice that feels like you have a responsibility for resilience of the grid and you have not read this report yet, take the time to look through it.
Well, I want to thank you both for a terrific presentation, and for those of us who haven't finished the report, I think you've encouraged us to do so. Again, thank you, and I want to thank the folks who've sent in comments and questions. And to conclude, I want to announce our next webinar, which is titled Advancing Energy Storage in the States, What's Your 2020 Vision? And that will be April 10th, 2019 from 2 to 3:30. So with that, I really can't tell you enough how much I appreciate your time and your contributions in both of your careers, and look forward to further engagement with National Regulatory Research Institute and the both of you. So with that, I'm going to...
You are most welcome. You are most welcome.
Well, thank you so much. Okay, with that, I'm going to end the webinar. Thank you.